We're just one more minute. Are we expecting Caroline or Rebecca? Okay. I don't know that Mark is coming today sometime.
We haven't heard from board member
Okay.
Judy.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. It is 1:01 PM and I'm calling the meeting of the Public Financing Authority to order. Would the recording secretary please do roll call?
Thank you, Chair Fleming. Board Member Corsi.
Here.
Board Member Gonzalez.
Here.
Board Member Judy absent. Board Member Hermosillo, she's absent. Vice Chair Futro
Here.
and Chair Fleming.
Here.
And let the record reflect that all board members are present with the exception of Board Member Judy, Board Member Hermosillo, and Board Member Rogers / Stapp.
Board member Stapp, thank you. Would you let, you're not our normal, our usual recording secretary. What's your name?
Crystal, yeah.
Okay, it's Crystal?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. It's on here. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't the last person. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, we'll go to item 2, announcements. Director Osborne.
Thank you, Chair. We just wanted to provide a brief update to the board that we are changing seats at this point. And this is really a typical process with the Board of Supervisors and the City Council. As the electeds fill these responsibilities, that role sometimes changes through the annual process of reseating members on the board. So Supervisor Rabbit has moved off and Supervisor Hermosillo will be filling in. So that role is solidified. On the city side, we are currently in the process of filling Chris Rogers' role. Mayor Stapp is the alternate and may fill in. That's a defined role that you can have in this process. So what we envision is someone else will be filling that role. So just a heads up that there will be new faces on the PFA, and just wanted to provide a quick overview of how that responsibility or how that process rolls out.
Thank you very much.
Chair Fleming,
Yes.
can I piggyback on
Sure.
that just a little bit? I understand that Supervisor Hermosillo has a structural conflict with this meeting, and it turns out that I do this year as well. So just want to let everybody know that it could become an issue for both of us for this meeting. I made a choice today to be here, but I'm not at the other one, so I've got to figure that out somehow. And we might want to consider changing the dates.
And if I may, Chair,
Please.
we actually have an agenda topic to talk about timeline, where we will be setting the specific dates for the meetings following. And I think that's the perfect opportunity to discuss conflicts and participation in that. And some of those may be off of our regular frequency, but we're more than happy to have that conversation and see what we can accommodate.
Good, thank you.
Excellent. Crystal, do we need to take public comment on announcements?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you. Item 3, minutes. We've got the September 19th, 2024 draft minutes. Does anybody here have any changes to the minutes? Okay. Do we happen to have any public comment on item 2.1, 3.1?
Seeing no hands, I think we're good to close public comment.
Wonderful. So we will accept the minutes as submitted. Does anybody have? Oh, hi. Apologies for the inconvenience. Welcome. We're just doing minutes and I was about to skip over asking the board if they had any changes. Does anybody have any changes? Okay. Can I get a motion, please?
So moved. Second.
All right, we'll adopt them as submitted. All right, item 4, comments on non-agenda matters. We are now taking public comment on item 4, non-agenda matters. This is the time when any person may address the board on matters not listed on the agenda, but which are within the subject matter of jurisdiction of this committee. Crystal, do we have any instructions for the public?
Yes, if you are present and wish to make a comment, please raise your hand and I'll provide a 3-minute countdown timer. Ms. Carmen, would you like to make a comment at this point? Seeing none, I think we're good to close.
Great, thank you. We'll now close public comment and move on to item 5, new business. I'd like to call item 5.1, which is a policy report for policy discussion. Reviewing recent changes to state code that affect the formation of the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, presented by Gabe Osborne, Director of the Planning and Economic Development Department.
Thank you, Chair, and please bear with me, board, as I pull up the presentation. Okay, thank you, Chair and members of the PFA. For our first agenda item, what we wanted to talk about is we did have some state changes that came into play towards the end of last year that affect the processing of EIFDs. So the goal today is to go over some of those changes. They really do streamline the process, but they change some of the format that we have previously discussed in meetings, as well as our timeline. And we'll also go over, because we are really rolling into the very formal process of adopting the IFP and forming the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District. So we'll talk a little bit about the public hearings and what will happen in those meetings, so the PFA is aware. And then in our second agenda item, we have more of a timeline. So as I go through the presentation, I'll pause when we complete this item, any questions, and then we'll move forward with the second item. So really what we saw under Senate Bill 1140, which was chaptered late in 2024, it changed the number of meetings that are needed to adopt an infrastructure financing plan and form the EIFD. And what we had talked about in previous meetings is really a 4-meeting structure. The first was to introduce the IFP. There's no formal action. The board just hears comments associated with that. There is then a formal public hearing where there is a discussion about the IFP. The second public hearing is to make changes to the IFP. Oh, thank you, Dario. So the second public hearing is to make changes to the IFP. Then it goes to the taxing entities, and then the third is to adopt. So essentially what happened under the state law is it really compressed the first and the second meeting. So under the first meeting, the public will be allowed to submit both written and oral comments. The board will review those comments. And then at that point, there's a process of either rejecting or modifying the IFP, and then it moves forward. And we'll talk more in future slides about that. It also changed the noticing process. So what we had talked about in the past was when we introduce the IFP, we have to make it available to the public 10 days prior to that action. And you still can leverage that process, but what it requires is public hearing noticing, notices in the Press Democrat, advance noticing for every public hearing. So to streamline, what the state added is really a 40-day prior to publishing the IFP noticing allowance. And that acts as the noticing for all future meetings. So that will notice for the introduction meeting and then the 2 required public hearings. And as long as the date, time, and location of those meetings does not change, we're not required to do any additional noticing. Makes it much easier on our side from facilitating those meetings, allows us to put more work in and less focus on noticing. So it really does help out from an efficiency standpoint, and we are proposing to leverage that process. So what you'll see is really the first step is to introduce the infrastructure financing plan. We are in the final stages of preparation on that document, and when we get into the timelines, I'll talk a little bit about when we will be proposing to release that to the public. And the PFA must hold a meeting where the draft IFP is made available. And this is where the 40-day noticing comes into play. We have to notice 40 days in advance of that meeting. So that will actually, where we thought we would have more of a meeting that fell on 30-day frequencies, that 40 days will push this out a little bit. Once again, we'll talk about that through the timeline. So the purpose of that meeting is to simply present the IFP. We will have DTA involved. They'll be doing the vast majority of the proposal to show how they went through the IFP. We'll talk about the various steps. It's very important to note that the PFA will have been able to view the IFP 40 days prior to this date, as well as members of the public. So there'll be an opportunity to digest some of the particulars associated with it. But this is really the meeting to discuss, present any questions, and obviously we'll have the technical expertise here to provide answers. So the noticing basically goes out to each, and this is how it's worded in state code, landlord, resident, or affected tax entity. So typically we notice based on a list of individual property owners. We notice to the residents based on the site address. So we'll mail it out to everyone in the district. And then it's presented to really the board and the city through more formal processes. The notice has to have a summary of the IFP. So we have to obviously finalize the IFP before we provide the noticing because it summarizes that. As I mentioned, there's location, date, and time of all the public hearings in that. There's a description of the actions to be taken. We will also provide information on how people provide written and oral comments. And what I'll talk a little bit about in future slides is there's a difference between written and oral comments and written and oral protests. There is a formal protesting process in this, but we will work through that and make sure the community understands the difference between the two. We have been talked internally about creating just centralized email addresses so we can funnel all this in through very dedicated channels and we can keep track of this. If the meeting does not occur on the dates and times that are presented in the 40-day noticing, we do have the ability to modify. It simply kicks in more traditional 10-day noticing if you move either the location, date, or time. So it does not mean we can't change it. It just means that we have to bring in more traditional noticing requirements prior to those meetings. So the first public hearing with the PFA, and an important point, they do require separation between these meetings and state code. So we cannot hold this meeting until 30 days after the IFP is introduced, and we factored this into the timeline that we'll show. So the PFA shall hear and consider any written and oral comments, and those oral comments likely come through the public hearing notice. As the public hearing opens, the oral comments are received. The written comments can be received prior to that. Staff will obviously provide a summary of those as that meeting begins, so you can really understand comments and concerns that the community may have had. So the PFA will hear all of that, and then the PFA takes action in that meeting to modify or reject the IFP. And I think an important point here is you can reject it just to say you bring it back to the starting line. That would have to be significant flaws in it, likely for the PFA to make that finding. A modification would include changes to that, and the PFA can modify really any aspect of that IFP document. And I think there's important to note that the PFA can also accept as proposed. So you don't necessarily need to make modifications to it. And really what this does is it passes it to the next public hearing. And in between the first and the second public hearing, it goes in front of the Board of Supervisors and the City Council to approve the IFP. So that's where a lot of the legwork that we've done up front to better understand tax increment and project list is to ensure that as it moves forward, that we get some level of approval from the taxing entities prior to getting to that point. And the formal action from the board and the council is to adopt resolutions approving the IFP. The state code does have language in it stating that the boards the taxing entities can bring forward recommendations to the PFA. But those recommendations obviously can't change some of those core functions about the infrastructure financing plan because that document is really approved by the jurisdictions at that point. Any changes have to bring it back through the process. So this is noticed as a public hearing. It is one of the numerous public hearings in this, but that just really goes through the normal noticing process that the jurisdictions go through.
Can I stop you for a minute?
Absolutely. Through the chair.
You mentioned with the first meeting with the PFA, we reject, we adopt, we modify. Is that the same process with the Board of Supervisors and City Council? Do they get that say at that point?
Yes. So what would happen at that point is it would likely, if substantial changes are made, and we're still working through the details with our legal consultant on this, is that it may, if the substantial changes are made to tax increment or things of that nature, it may push all the way back through the process. So you have to restart that first public hearing with the PFA. You have to reintroduce the IFP. I think there may be some discretion there on the level of change that's made. But I think where we really had concern was over the tax increment commitment, because that can substantially change the document as a whole because all the mathematical calculations are based on that. So fixing errors, project lists, things of that nature, a lot of the discussion we'll have and we'll provide as we get into these public hearings, will provide a summary of how this decision-making process works, and depending on how it goes, how it'll affect the process. But really, some of the concerns were that if the changes are made there and they're substantial, does it restart the introduction process, first public hearing, and you move back? Because it really is deviating from what the PFA approved at that point in the first public hearing. So we're trying to hold it as much as possible. And I think that's where the introduction meeting becomes very important. And really understanding how it's communicated through the public process. And if it changes, how is that then communicated to the Board of Supervisors and the City Council? But I think tax increment commitment has been so important because of the impacts it has to budgets in both taxing entities. So we really tried to solidify that. So the last public hearing is the PFA shall consider all written and oral protests. So this is a bit different than a comment because this can be a formal protest to basically say that the PFA should not adopt the IFP. From what I've heard is these are fairly uncommon. The IFD concept does not increase taxes. So there's not really a financial impact to each individual property owner. But there still are provisions in state code to require that protest hearing and to move forward with that. So what we will do, that will be opening a public hearing. We will hear any protests from the community. We will have the written protests in hand at that point if they exist, and we'll go over those with members of the community. There is discussion to be had internally from a legal aspect that based on that protest, how much review needs to be done. If someone says, we just don't like an EIFD, we don't think it's good, where it's more of a policy decision, that's different. If there's legal challenges on how we've stepped through the process, there may be a pause to review those. So depending on those, but in most situations, those take the form of written, and we have the ability to digest that prior to the meeting. And basically the way it works, if we get protest hearings that are, written or oral protests that are over 50% of the number of landlords and residents, it's the cumulative. And some of the conversations that we're having internally is it's very difficult sometimes to understand the number of residents. We're talking about individuals that are of 18 years old or older. So we're working with our legal counsel to understand how that works and to develop those lists. But if 50% comes in, it's done. It eclipses that number. If less than 25% come in, it moves forward. And then the next action in that same meeting would be the PFA would be able to adopt the IFP. So it all is really joined into that same meeting. Where it becomes a bit unique, if you fall in the 25 to 50%, it really triggers what's referred to as an election. That meeting is then terminated. And then within 90 days, we have to set a meeting where the PFA determines a procedure for the balloting. And then based on that balloting result, depending on where you end up, if you're over 50%, then it's terminated. If it is terminated, the PFA cannot reintroduce an IFP for a year. So it holds it for a 12-month period. So that's more of the legal process. Like I said, we'll have more information on that as it goes. We'll provide instructions on. Welcome, Supervisor Hermosillo.
Hi,
Thank you for joining us today. So we'll provide more information on that as it gets closer. And sorry, this is some of what I covered in the previous conversation. This, just talks a little bit about how that protest hearing works. This is subject to referendum, which basically means once the PFA actually makes a determination on the IFP and the formation of the district, because those are the legal actions, it's really a 30-day effective date. So 31 days from the date that that's occurred, it sets an effective date, and that effective date tracks with the base tax year. So how it works is the last equalized tax roll, which typically occurs in August, equalizes the taxes for the previous year. So if we are able to stay in front of August, we are able to track the last year. So that's 23-24. And really where that becomes important, and that's what we've said in the past, how it controls our timeline, is we're trying to catch the increment from the active developments that would potentially be reassessed and drive that up. So we're trying to catch that tax year. So much of our conversation really has been this fiscal year timeline of July, but we do have padding. So we can pull that all the way into the third week of August. So that gives us a little more time. And I think that's beneficial as we look through the timeline, especially if dates don't work. We can talk a little bit about where we have padding and how we can move things around. But as you can see, it becomes a very linear process. And, you know, if parts and pieces don't necessarily fall, it doesn't mean that we're done. It just means we're back to the starting line. And if we're back to the starting line, we can't hit the August date. It means that we're really losing the tax year. And I think that's really why we've been putting so much legwork into doing a lot of this upfront and making sure that we get some of this correct, giving a lot of information to the PFA, having conversations about projects. So we're really not making these larger course corrections that would potentially trigger that action. And I believe that is it for this item. It is. So back to you, Chair.
Great, thank you very much for that. Welcome Supervisor Hermosillo, our newest board member.
Thank you.
And you know, since I'm sure you're all studied up on this, do you want to start? I'm just kidding. Totally kidding.
So
Just a little bit of light hazing to get you
right?
going,
I know.
right?
I'll
Yeah, yeah,
take it.
yeah.
I'll take it.
But anyway, would anybody like to ask any questions? Mr. Futura.
Just to clarify the parties who are being noticed, you mentioned the 40-day advance notice, residents, property owners, landlords. Are the subsequent public hearings noticed on the same basis, or is it broader than that?
It's the same notice for the subsequent public hearings.
Okay.
So that 140-day notice meets all requirements for all meetings.
And is the protest limited to the property owners or the residents as well?
It's the cumulative of the property owners and the residents.
Okay. On a one business, one resident basis, presumably?
These are a lot of the details that we're currently ironing out. Obviously, you have business-related pieces. You typically fall back on listed owners, but you can see that you can't always tell the individuals that are behind the listed owner on a property from the recorder's office. Also, the issues of the residents can be challenging. We can go back on registered voters and addresses to determine that. So really, there's similar language in other processes in the state code. And really, we're looking at a best practice here. So we'll know more on this front, and we'll talk probably more about this as an agenda item as we introduce the IFP, because this is an important piece to make sure we have all of our ducks in a row.
And if it goes to an election, is it on the same basis, residents and property owners? Because you mentioned the assessment role, which of course would relate to the property owners.
It's not clearly defined in the code. And I think that next 90-day meeting where the PFA makes a determination on the election, we're currently reviewing to see if the PFA has discretion to control that or change that requirement. My assumption would be is no, because that it's sort of set in the protest hearing, but the language is silent on that.
Thank you.
As to noticing, since it includes residents, will the noticing also be in Spanish?
Yes, so there are provisions that require specific translation services in the state code, where it looks at the certain percentage of individuals that speak really English as a second language. And then it looks at that second language that is not the predominant, and it requires translation services. So we are prepared to translate in Spanish.
Wonderful. Mr. Corsi?
Some of the uncertainty around this, that were in your answers to Hugh's questions. The process sounds a little bit like annexation, protest and election and percentages. Can annexation rules inform us about some of those uncertainties?
It's possible. I think from a best practice standpoint, when we see these, there are certain things where you're doing community benefit districts, or you're doing annexations, or you're doing really anything that has tax impacts on this area, where the rules seem to be fairly similar, but they deviate somewhat in the language. So in conjunction with coordinating with our city attorney's office, we do have legal counsel that we brought in that has expertise on this. I think as jurisdictions go through these, it's really the one time that they do it. And as they go through it for the first time, there are learning curves there. So I think utilizing those best practices and understanding what's the most legally defensible tactic, sometimes when the state code is not descriptive or fairly ambiguous in some areas, that's the exercise that we'll be going through. But I think to specifically answer your question, possibly, we'd have to see if that would be legally defensible and filling in the gap. But I think there may also be best practices for others that have gone through EIFDs, but a lot of this language is fairly new. But the protest hearing piece, if my memory serves, was not. Like that was, there was always a protest allowance in the formation of an EIFD.
I wanted to ask about the content of the notice. Do we actually send out the financing plan as part of the notice?
So the financing plan is posted on the website, and then the noticing directs back in a mailed form. The noticing does provide a summary. We will make hard copies available upon request. We will make direct mailed copies available on request. That's not necessarily required in the noticing, but simply as a customer service standpoint, as people get the written notice, it'll be posted on the website that we will provide a hard copy if needed.
Does the summary, can it include information such as your tax rate is not going to change?
Yes.
The benefit, the money will be used for such and such.
Yes. We have spun up a dedicated EIFD website that has some frequently asked questions. We will be in the process here over the next few weeks of evolving that a bit. As this timeline solidifies, that will be identified there. But yes, the summary does talk a little bit about what EIFDs do, how they are formed. And then I think really an important point is exactly what you're mentioning in that written notice, that this does not increase property taxes. Because I think, because these are fairly complicated, I tell people quite often, there are a lot of acronyms and it's hard to get up to speed, and it's a fairly complicated process. So I think really just simplifying that for members of the public to ensure that they know basically what we're trying to do with this. And then it does not have a financial impact to them. And as I said, that I think, the industry standards have shown that typically, because it does not do that, that typically there is not a lot of community feedback in a negative way, and there are typically not a high number of protests. That seems to be how these are moving forward.
Okay, thanks.
But if I may, Chair, just to allay any concerns over the election piece, I think it's important to note that this body will have an opportunity to guide, weigh in on how the election process would take place. And so, yes, we absolutely can look at annexation procedures as a guide if that is this body's pleasure.
Okay.
Wonderful. All right. Do we have any public comments?
Yes, if you are present and wish to make a comment, please raise your hand. No? Okay.
I'll
Seeing
raise my
none.
hand.
All right, with that, we will close public comment and bring it back to anybody, any final comments? We're not going to take action on this. We're just.
I just have through the chair, a clarifying question. So the determination on the IFP is really the action of the public authority. So that's whether at the second hearing, whether we have received 50% or not, right? That's staff will advise on that as the hearing goes on, my understanding. And then this body will determine whether to adopt the resolution. Is it a resolution at this point? I'm just a little unclear. Adopt the resolution at that point, and then that moves it forward. So we wouldn't be amending the percentages, contributions from the city or the county. We wouldn't necessarily be amending at this point, even amending the project list. We would be accepting the project list as it is written. Is that
So through the
accurate?
chair, in the second hearing, you are correct.
Yeah.
The first hearing, however, this body does have an opportunity
Right.
to make modifications to the infrastructure financing plan.
Yeah.
And so a point of clarification, you all would be in the second hearing after the protest hearing, you would either adopt or reject
Got
the
it.
infrastructure financing plan. Assuming you adopt it, then you would move to for adopting the formation of the infrastructure EIFD. And that would be a resolution.
Got it. Yeah. So I just wanted to underline that point that at that second hearing, we are not making any changes to the project list. We're not making any changes to the percentages contribution from any of the entities. It's thumbs up, thumbs down, and whether we have the majority support from the residents and the property owners. Got it. Okay.
As through the chair, and that's an incredibly important statement, but I think when you look at the introduction of the IFP, there's no resolution. That's just a
Right,
discussion. When you
right.
get into the first public hearing, there is a
There is a
resolution. We're
resolution.
dealing with formal actions. And then we really have to view the protest hearing and the adoption as two separate things that are happening in the same meeting.
So, yeah.
So you close the protest hearing because the 25% was not hit, and we move forward. And at that point, there is an adoption of the IFP and the formation of the EIFD.
Got it.
And that is the final step. And then we are going into the referendum or the effective date period. And then we take it to the Board of Equalization for final list prior to the end of the calendar year.
Rock and roll at that point.
Yes.
Got it.
Rock and roll indeed. I have a question following on that, which is, we've talked about that. It would be possible to amend project specifics down the road. Does that mean that they have to fall under the project categories, but the specific projects don't have to be exactly enumerated on that list, right? Okay.
Yes, correct. Yeah, so I think we can, with the discussions with the project list, obviously broad categories, specific projects, we can go between those. I think the only risk I would have to say that would be run here is if, because much of the project list has been presented to the Board of Supervisors through that and to the City Council. Most of the focus conversations there were really on tax percentage. And if the project list is changed from that, because we tried to keep it as intact as possible, and that's what you will see in the draft IFP, it can change and it can be massaged. If for whatever reason it goes to the Board of Supervisors and the City Council and there's some desire not to accept that project list, then we hit the restart button. But this would be a discussion in the introduction in a formal action to make those changes in the second hearing. But absolutely, there can be modifications to the project list.
To that point, Chair, I think that was the reason that we tried to keep the project buckets as broad as possible.
Yeah.
Because my understanding is that the way that it is, the way that it has been presented to the Board of Supervisors and the City Council, if you all want to be more prescriptive about the buckets that have already been identified, then my understanding is that won't necessarily restart the process. But if you all were to say, instead of X bucket, we want Y bucket, then I think there will probably be a larger conversation with council to see whether or not that would restart the whole process.
Got it. All right, thank you very much. All right, with that, we'll move on to item 5.2. It's a policy discussion led by Walton.
Thank you, Chair. So the next item on our agenda is a discussion about timeline. So based on where we are with the preparation of the IFP, the steps that we've taken with the Board of Supervisors and City Council, we wanted to get down a more detailed timeline. We've talked a bit in the past about general months and where we would try to tackle. But with all the legal framework around this, we worked up a more defined timeline with dates. So what we wanted to really do is talk about how this really works with the PFA moving forward. We can talk a little bit about where there is flexibility because I think we do have some padding here. But our first step, and this is really internal to the city, is to finalize the draft IFP and notice for all the meetings. And our goal is to get that completed by February 3rd. That will give us a little bit of time to mail the notice and post the draft IFP to the website by February 6th. Those are approximate dates. We do have some padding there, 40 days out, but that's really internally what we're targeting at this point. Once February 6th rolls around or a date close to that, the draft IFP will be available to the public as well as the PFA. So that's when our hope is that everybody takes some time to digest it and understand some of the components of it. Because really our next step is the introduction meeting. This would push out to March. We talked about this being a bit earlier in the process before, but this is really due to the 40-day advance noticing process. So it's right now pushing out to March 20th. That would actually fall on our regular frequency of the third Thursday of every month. And what we try to do as much as possible is honor that as the agreed upon date. But what you'll see is that the challenge we really run into here is that because of the 30 days, it doesn't necessarily align. And then we also have some holidays that we were fighting with there too, and we had to move our June date around. So the first public hearing, that would fall on the fourth Thursday. So we're looking at April 24 of 2025. The city council adoption, we have internally put that on our advanced calendar for June 3rd. This would give the Board of Supervisors the adoption of the IFP in May or early June. When we look at this, we're not really too concerned about compression if these things really move forward because it's adopting the same document. So we're not padding in a significant amount of working time between these dates. And then our second public hearing is falling on the fourth Thursday, which is June 26, 2025. And then our effective date, I believe I have an error in that. That's 30 days. It would actually be 31 days after. So that's really going to fall on July 26th. But you can see this does give us a little padding because based on this timeline, we have really a month and a half for the board to work out potentially scheduling. And then we can also push into August. So we have about probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks to play around with in this time frame as we move things around. What I try to do as much as possible is keep this in July, so we're not pushing it. But I would love to hear feedback on these dates to see what works, what doesn't, and then potentially talk about where we can move it around to where it works best for the majority of the PFA.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about any of these dates?
I know I'm okay in March for the 20th, and I know I'm not going to be here June 26th.
June 26th. Okay, any other conflicts that people know about?
Not with the timeline, but the meeting, the current meeting time.
The current meeting schedule, right? Exactly. So my question of you all is, are these meeting dates, the third Thursdays that we're seeing here?
So the first one is
Mhm.
March 20th. That falls on the regular frequency.
February 3rd is not a meeting that we're gonna have. I
No.
can't see very well.
Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
Yeah, so basically the February 3rd, February 6th, those are just internal staff
Okay,
deadlines,
got
not
it.
meetings.
Mhm.
So the first meeting is March 20th.
Uh-huh,
That does fall on the regular frequency, and we
Okay.
would be proposing the regular time, 1 o'clock.
okay.
The first public hearing falls on the fourth Thursday.
That's the April 24.
That's April 24.
Okay,
And then the second public hearing falls on the fourth Thursday. We tried the third Thursday, that is Juneteenth, so
Mhm.
that falls on a holiday. But it is important to note that the times, the dates, the times can change for these.
uh-huh. Okay. So both the supervisors are unable to do third Thursdays, but the fourth Thursday does work?
Right now, the third Thursday in March works for me.
Right.
The fourth one in June does not.
How are fourth Thursdays for the rest of the group?
March 27th, correct? So we would be adjusting to March 27th. I'm just, sorry. Then you have to bump out that first public hearing, correct?
Well, we would
So
leave the March 20th since
we're gonna leave
nobody,
that one.
you guys don't have a conflict with that one.
But
Yeah, so we're really looking at, 4 Thursdays for April, June, and do we need to meet in July? No, so just April and June. We do the 4 Thursdays in April and June?
Well, we may need to push into July if Supervisor Corsi cannot attend on June 26th.
Mhm. So April 24th is the fourth Thursday in April. So that one's good. And then the next one would be the June meeting, which would need to be rescheduled.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or toast.
So I'm good with those dates.
Okay.
Sorry, had to drag that out, but.
It's okay. There is a chance, late June, early July is always really challenging for me. I may need to rely on, my vice chair, for that very final meeting, but I'll try to be here remotely.
And I think it's important to note that we don't necessarily have to stick to just moving it to the third or the fourth Thursday. Any dates are open for these. I think that probably the biggest impact is if we move the March date, it starts pushing things down because you're looking
Yeah.
at the 30-day window. When you get into the dates, or excuse me, the time frame between the first and the second public hearing, there's play there.
Right.
Really what we're doing is essentially, I think maybe reducing if those meetings are down and they don't affect the June date, that it may be reducing the timeframe in which the county can get.
I think you're hearing a commitment from us to meet on March 20th as scheduled. And then we can go from there in dealing with schedule adjustments and summertime travel plans as they present themselves and trying to make sure we get this done well cleared of August. The other question I had was, do we need to meet regularly if we do not have action items?
And that's an incredibly important point. So basically, this is really the big push for the PFA. So once you form the EIFD, and this can be a discussion about regular occurring meetings, the meetings are much less frequent. You're talking about annual reporting. It is not on the same time frame you have now. And generally with how the revenue is spun up in EIFDs, it's a little bit and then it grows, it grows, it grows. So there's really not much activity after you get out of this. So would be happy to put, as we get closer, I'd be happy to put an agenda item on that talks about the frequency so we can discuss potentially changing that around and what that would look like. But really our focus now is to get through these next 3 meetings and then we can talk about that. But it definitely will not be on the monthly frequency. That was simply set up to get us to the finish line.
Well, I think more specifically in the short term, that's helpful. Long-term information. Shall we meet in February or in May even, or is it okay to just have these meetings scheduled for these dates? And if for some reason we have business that comes up, we can try to convene a meeting.
Yes, you have that flexibility.
Yes.
And so if
Okay.
you would prefer to simply stick to the introduction meeting and the 2 public hearing dates, I don't believe they're required to meet in between those if it's not necessary.
Right, well, I'm asking, is it useful? And that's a question for the committee here as well as for staff.
So I would say if we stick with these, that we're following the process. If for whatever reason we get through the March meeting and there's questions about what we're going to present, and depending on the level of feedback, because there's no formal action in March, then we will do our best to take the discussions that happen at the PFA to form potentially a proposal, or we will just move it forward with the second public hearing as is, and then the discussion about modification takes place there.
So you'll let us know if you.
So
need
we
to
can
meet.
let you know, but my initial thought is that if we can stay on this schedule, that works. And then obviously there were certain off ramps for protest hearings and things of that nature. But this works for our needs to present it to you. And then I think, Chair, if there's anything that comes up where we think it's beneficial to have more of a policy discussion, we can add more meetings in that frequency.
Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, in terms of when we see the work product and may have some opportunity to confirm it or reshape it. So on February 6th, in a draft form, that IFT is going to be out to the public. When it comes, and when the introduction meeting on March 20th happens, we have the opportunity to look at that. Correct me where I've got this wrong. And there is the opportunity to reshape that document a bit if we choose. Then it comes to the first hearing where we, after hearing public testimony, we again have another opportunity to reshape it as part of that meeting. But when it comes to the second, it will have picked up whatever we've done up to that point. And with the second hearing, we have the opportunity to say yes or no, basically. Our ability to shape things is prior to that.
That is correct.
And if we decided we didn't have quite enough time to reshape it, you've got the opportunity maybe to have an insertion meeting in there somewhere. Except the risk is, depending what people say, it could have an impact on the whole rest of the process.
Correct. Yes, and I think it is important to note, so the introduction meeting is not a formal action. It's a discussion meeting, very similar to the policy discussions. The first public hearing is a formal resolution of modification. And then those are passed through, and to your point, Board Member Futrell, then the second public hearing is really blessing the document and moving it forward.
Got it.
And I think just to note, an important piece here too is as these dates move, they can. but we have 40-day noticing requirements that we're going to be moving in February, and we're trying our best to pin the dates down to avoid re-noticing. So that's another,
Understood.
not that we don't have to, but
Board Member Judy and then Board Member Hermosillo.
So the draft IFP is going out to the public, being posted to the public prior to this board seeing the draft document. Yeah,
Formally,
formally.
you all will have an opportunity to review that just like the public on the 6th. On or around the 6th.
and that's the specific state code requirement.
And what appears there is going to reflect the conversation we've had.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. It shouldn't be out of the blue, but.
Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify my conflict. I have a conflict in March as well.
On the 20th.
Yeah, the March one, the April's fine, and then the June 26th is fine.
Okay, could we do March 27th, okay?
Can I ask a clarifying question? You have Supervisor Hermosillo, a conflict that entire day or just at 1 p.m.?
I need to be at BCDC at 1 o'clock in the city, so.
So could
Let
we
me,
do morning, like if you were
are you
out of here by
thinking-
11,
Second, because I have,
9 AM?
some months I have zero waste. Give me 1 second. I could do the morning.
Okay, but Supervisor Corsi says the morning is not ideal. We could search for another day. We could proceed with a quorum and not have you here at the meeting. I'd love to have you here at the meeting, but we don't have to determine, as far as I understand, the date today, because it's about a few weeks. But it could be more difficult for staff if we don't get a date nailed down right now.
So looking at our timelines and our normal frequency, this being our January meeting, we're looking at posting the IFP and the noticing prior to our February meeting. We could have our February meeting, so it would be incredibly helpful if we can get these dates today.
Okay, let's do it then. All right, everybody want to get their calendars out?
We
Try to find another date.
February now.
Are we looking at February?
Well, we don't have to meet in February. We could meet in March. Would it be, does it need to be 40 days from February 6th, or is it that the April 24th meeting has to be 40 days from when we met in March?
So whenever the March meeting occurs, we have to notice 40 days before that. So I think based on our process, the soonest we can notice with the work that we have to do is February 6th. And March 20th gives us a little padding 40 days out. So likely what I would recommend, if March 20th doesn't work, we go later in March. And it could be the 27th, and we can look at, we'll obviously move the April date because we're 30 days off of that. But my recommendation would be to move that March date that direction.
And it does not need to be on a Thursday, Chair.
Right. I'm just thinking of when is typically convenient for folks.
Does that 19th work, the day before?
It would work for me.
March 19th.
Wednesday.
I could do it in the morning of the 19th. Let me make this easier. Keep it on the 20th. And I'll tell the other meeting that I can't make that one. So could do it in the morning of the 20th.
So I didn't hear any conflict on the 19th from anyone. Did anybody have a conflict?
I do, but
All the day on the 19th?
yeah,
Okay. All right, then we'll take you up on your offer. Thank you.
Morning of the 20th.
Yes, at 9 AM. If we're out of here by 10:30, you'll be in the city by 1.
Just a heads up, the morning of the 20th in March has another meeting scheduled in this room, so we would have to move rooms. Or I
Okay.
could kick the other meeting out.
Otherwise, we'll do it on Saturday.
Sorry.
Could you just a ray of
Zoning
sunshine right
administrator
now?
I'm just having fun. I had some coffee today. All right. Okay, so we are, the next meeting, the March 20th meeting will be on at 9 AM. Great, wonderful. We do have to take public comment on this item. Do we have any?
Ms. Janice, would you like to?
All right, well, with that, thank you to staff and board members for all of your
Thank you.
participation today. And we will adjourn until March 20th.
May I make a clarification and ask that you unadjourn for just a
Sure,
moment? I
happy
just
to
want to make
unadjourn.
sure staff has direction on the future date. So we have the 20th at 9 a.m. and then you're moving at your 1 p.m. time on April 24th. Is that
Mhm.
correct?
That's what I have here.
Okay, and then we're going to go ahead with the June 26th. I think that we have a couple of folks who potentially have conflicts on June 26th.
I think we're probably gonna have to like tighten up that June meeting time as we get our summer. That'll be like something that I'll probably circle back with on the April meeting.
So I think staff is going to notice all of the hearing dates in the.
Sure, we can use that as a placeholder date and we'll do everything we can to make that work.
Okay,
That works.
Are we able to change it if it's in the 40-day notice then?
Yes.
Yes, we just do additional 10-day notice.
Quick observation. I'm noticing since businesses alone, unless they own the property, would not be getting notices. Maybe there should be a mechanism figured out that the businesses are informed of what's going on.
We do mail to the site address, though.
Current occupant and absent owners.
I see.
Wonderful. All right, shall we re-adjourn? Okay, great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.